Chapter 12. The Palace of the British in Rome. Following the pardon of King Caradoc, a close relationship developed between him and his former enemy, Emperor Claudius. Caradoc helped Claudius plan Roman war strategies that did not affect Britain, and he became a popular figure with the Roman administrators. Emperor Claudius greatly admired the character and beauty of teenage Gladius, the youngest daughter of King Caradoc, named after Jesus Canubilin's daughter and Caradoc's sister. It grew into a deep affection, with the result that Emperor Claudius adopted Gladius Caradoc as his own daughter and conferred upon her the name Claudia. The House of Claudia used many different forenames and surnames, and through this title, the British princess and her entire family received additional status and were now officially of the House of Claudius. In the year 53, and at the age of 17, Claudia Caradoc married Rufus Pudens Pudentius, a wealthy Roman senator and former aide-de-camp to Aulus Plautius, whom she met at Regnum, the old name for Caister, as a youngster living in Britain. From the sparse documentation available, it seemed that he owned a residence in Chichester and was in some way an associate or member of the powerful Acilii Glabrionis family of Rome. Cardinal Barionis chronicled a curious record about Rufus, saying Rufus the senator received St. Peter, Simon of Petra, into his house on Vermillinus Hill in the year 44 A.D. 9 years later, the same Senator Rufus married Claudia at the British Palace in Rome by a man called Hermes Pastor, sometimes translated as Hermes, who was known to both St. Paul and St. Peter. On the marriage of his daughter to Pudens, as he was generally called, King Caradoc bestowed upon the bridal couple a gift, the British Palace on Vermillinus Hill in Rome. Pudens then forsook his parental home on another section of Vermillinus Hill, along with his estates in Samnium, Umbria, now called Italy, and prepared to live at the palace of the British. Some conception may be formed of its size and magnificence from the number of servants Pudens brought in to staff the establishment, being 200 males and the same number of females, all born on the hereditary states of Pudens at Umbria. Adjoining the palace were 2 magnificent thermal baths, the largest and most ornate in Rome. They were later named after the 2 sons subsequently born to Claudia and Pudens, Timoteo or Timotheus, and Novato or Novatian. They also had 2 daughters named Pudentiana and Praxides. Of Claudia, the witty poet Martial, one of the Bethany group and residents at the British Palace in Rome, wrote, "Our Claudia, named Rufina, sprung, we know, from blue-eyed Britons, yet behold she vies in grace with all that Greece or Rome can show, as bred and born beneath their glowing skies." Rufina was the feminine vernacular for her husband's first name, Rufus. It was common custom to refer to a married woman personally by replacing her own first name with his. Names then were used rather indiscriminately, which tends to confuse us who retain throughout our lifetime our given and family name. Consequently, it can be bewildering to read of the British princess called by so many names: Gladys, Claudia, Britannica, Rufina, Pudens, Pudencia, and Pudenziana, all before she was 21. The dark-haired Romans admired the golden-haired, blue-eyed, pink-complexioned women of Britain. Again, Marshall sang with praise for mountains, bridges, rivers, and fair women. British is past compare. Marshall wrote a long poem describing the nuptials of Claudia and Pudens. He also wrote another in the birth of Claudia's daughter, Pudentiana. Claudia's firstborn son, Timotheus, was named after one of her favorite Christians who frequented her home, Timothy from Ephesus, in today's church St. Timothy. Timotheus, later in his life, deeded the palace of the British in Rome to the Christian movement. In the New Testament, Timothy was associated with John and Paul, St. John and St. Paul today. Paul referred to Timotheus as the beloved son of Christ, which originally read the beloved grandson of Christ, Rabbi Jesus Christ. The occupants of the British palace. Thus we see in mid-1st century Rome the gathering together of particular characters in preparation for the role that they were to subsequently play in what was later to become the greatest misunderstanding in the history of the world. Residing at the palace of the British at various times during King Caradoc's confinement were the Archdruid of Britain, Rabbi Jesus Canubilan, Bran the Blessed, his son, King Caradoc, and his wife, Queen Venus Julia, daughter of Emperor Claudius. King Caradoc's daughter, Princess Urgane, and her husband, Solog, the Prince of Old Sarum, Salisbury now. Princess Urgane's brother, Prince Linus, King Caradoc's son. Claudia Gladys, King Caradoc's daughter, her husband, Senator Pudens, and their 4 children. Claudia died peacefully at Umbria, aged 61, in the year 97. The mother of Pudens and St. Paul, Praeside, also now pronounced Priscilla, Hermes Pastor, kinsman of Pudens, Martial, the poet. He was born in 29 and was only 8 years old when he traveled with the Bethany group to Britain. It was recorded that he moved to Rome in 49 and lived there until 86. He died at Bibulus in Spain in 104 at age 75. Going to and from the palace were the following people, some being next of kin of Rabbi Jesus, and all connected by marriage or sympathy. Paul, or Saul, now St. Paul, Simon of Petra, now St. Peter, Timothy, now St. Timothy, King Caradoc's sister Pomponia, Gracina, now Gladys, and her husband Aulus Platius, who resided in a nearby street, Tacitus. Cadwal, the Blessed, and Polydor, the sons of Rabbi Jesus Canubiline by Princess Mary Magdalene. They lived in Britain and traveled regularly to Rome. Flavius Justinius. Justinius was a Roman citizen and is today called Saint Justin Martyr. There were other New Testament characters recorded living in the palace. Tryphena, Persis, Patrobas, and Julia, for example. But those mentioned here are important figures in unraveling the New Testament story. The later church writers attested that all the Pudens household at the British palace were Christians, but Rabbi Jesus Canubiline, King Caradoc, Claudia, Urgane, Solog, Linus, and Hermas Pastor were all Druidic emissaries of British royalty, the Royal Silurians. They represented the chief assembly of personalities who were unwittingly responsible for what was later to evolve in the narratives of the New Testament. The true authors of the epistles. The letters attributed to Paul in the Bible are promoted as divine writings by the Church and represent 14 of the 27 books of the Christian New Testament. They were addressed to the Galatians, the Corinthians, the first and second letters, the Romans, the Thessalonians, the first and second letters, the Ephesians, the Colossians, the Philippians, Philemon, Timothy, the first and second letters, Titus, and Hebrews. Philemon, Timothy, and Titus were the only letters addressed to individuals. Of the collection, the Canon of Muratori, a Latin fragment of the canon found by Muratori in the Ambrosian Library at Milan in 1740, recorded that Ephesians, formerly called Laodiceans, was a forgery, although it is in the Bible today. The letters made up about a third of the New Testament, and the Church has always maintained that they represented the personal teachings of Paul, the great apostle of the Gentiles. But archival records said something entirely different, naming Paul as the author of only 2 epistles, and then, with some doubt, none of the letters were associated with what is now known as Christianity, for the majority were addressed to the major Essene communities of the day. They, the Essenes, had missionary stations or colonies of their community established in Rome, Corinth, Galatia, Ephesus, Philippi, Colossae, and Thessalonica, precisely such and in the same circumstances as were those to whom St. Paul addressed his letter in those places. The original authors of the epistles of Paul were documented in pre-1900 editions of the Oxford Bible. This is what was recorded. Romans. This letter was written by Tertius, Romans 16:22, and delivered by Phoebe to the palace of the British in Rome. In some translation, Phoebe was Paul's sister, Romans 16:1. Corinthians. The first epistle to the Corinthians was written from Philippi by Stephanius and Fortunatus and Achaicus and Timotheus. Corinthians, the second epistle to the Corinthians, was written from Philippi, a city of Macedonia, by Titus and Lucas. Galatians. Unto the Galatians, written from Rome, the author was unnamed. Ephesians, written from Rome unto the Ephesians by Tychus. Philippians, it was written to the Philippians from Rome by Epaphroditus. Colossians, written from Rome by the Colossians by Tychius and Onesimus. Thessalonians. The first epistle unto the Thessalonians was written from Athens, as was the second epistle. In both cases, the author was unnamed. Timothy. The first epistle to Timothy was written from Laodicea, which is the chiefest city of Phrygia Poxitiana. The author was unnamed. The second epistle to Timotheus was written from Rome, when Paul was brought before Nero the second time. The church claimed that because Paul was in Rome, he was the author. Titus. It was written to Titus, ordained the first bishop of the Church of the Cretans from Nicopolis of Macedonia. Philemon. Written from Rome to Philemon by Onesimus, a servant. Hebrews. Written to the Hebrews from Italy by Timothy. Church records show that the authors of all but 2 of the epistles reproduced in the New Testament were Tertius, Stephanas, Fortunatus, Achaicus, Timotheus, Titus, Lucas, Tychius, Epaphroditus, Tychicus, Onesimus, Nicopolis, Onesimus, and Timothy. The epistle that may be attributed to Paul are Galatians. Cardinal Baronius wrote that it was written to the Gauls, or the Galileans, and must be corrected. Timothy, a relative of Paul, also a resident at the palace of the British. The Church admitted that some of the New Testament epistles were forgeries, and those that were genuine were later falsified. Even the genuine epistles were greatly interpolated to lend weight to the personal views of their authors. The epistles of the New Testament are heavily interpolated and doubtful works. Over and over again in the Variornium Teacher's Bible, verse after verse, referring particularly to the epistles, was pointed out as being corrupted or suspected of being corrupted, not original, or embellished, with some translations being described as conjecture only. It makes truly extraordinary reading, and the express findings of those theologians unquestionably established that the Acts of the Apostles, James, the letters of Peter and John and Jude, all the epistles are heavily edited and forged documents. By the end of the 2nd century, the Ebionites, one of the most powerful of the early sects, totally and constantly rejected all epistles. They said the original letters had received numerous modifications and disregarded them. The Church itself expressed further serious doubt about the validity of the epistles, particularly the 3 known as the pastoral epistles, for it constantly used the word "if genuine" when referring to those documents. It admitted those letters may have been written by a disciple of Paul, and if that was the case, only one New Testament epistle can be attributed to Paul, Galatians. In Galatians, Paul acknowledged 3 Galatian apostles, Simon of Petra, James Herod, the half-brother of Judas and Jesus, and Barnabas. Recognizing the facts, we can well understand why the ancient writers affirmed that Paul spent most of his time in Rome at the sanctuary of the British palace. Paul was the ringleader of the Nazarenes, a subsidiary offshoot of the Essene movement. Bishop Tertullian confirmed again that Paul was the chief of the Nazarenes and was constantly pursued by the military. St. Epiphanius said that all Christians were called Nazarenes, and Dr. Lardner established that the name Galilean was the original name of the early Christian movement. Judas Christus and Simon of Petra were Nazarenes leading the Galilean sect, and from the brief records available, it seemed that Paul, while continuing their work, Acts 9:25, was captured and returned to Rome a prisoner on parole. While in Rome, he deprived Nero of his favorite concubine and seduced his ablest secretaries. That is why they kept him so long confined in the Marmotine, now called a dungeon. The Bible recorded that Paul was a pestilent fellow and a mover of sedition. He was a major leader of the active Christian revolutionist sect and was continually being hunted and stoned. Paul eventually fled to Britain for royal Druidic protection at the enclosure built under Rabbi Jesus' instruction at Siluria in Wales. Addressing the mayors of Bath, Colchester, and Dorchester at the Vatican in 1931, Pope Pius XI said that St. Paul went to Britain some 20 years after Joseph of Arimathea, circa 57. An ancient manuscript in Merton College, Oxford, purported to contain a series of letters written by St. Paul supporting that he had once resided in Siluria. Paul was known by a variety of appellations, and his name often appears in distorted form. Paul, which meant little man, was a nickname. He was sometimes called Elisha ben Abuah in the Talmud. The Talmud said of Ahir Paul in the Yerushalmi that he corrupted the work of that man, meaning Rabbi Jesus. Paul's nickname was supported with a peculiar description of him in the Acts of Paul. He was described as a little man with a big, bold head. His legs are crooked, his eyebrows grew close together, and he had a big nose. It was said that at one time he had his head shorn in Cenchrea because he had taken a vow. The common inference was that Paul returned to the bosom of the royal British family in Rome in the year 58, but St. Jerome said he returned in the 2nd year of Nero, which was 56. Nero succeeded Claudius as emperor of Rome. Before Paul returned, he instructed Tertius, the author of the letter to those at Rome, to pass on Paul's greetings and best wishes. Those at Rome were the occupants of the palace of the British, and not a new Roman church professing to develop Christian faith. Paul's salutations extended to more than 30 people, including Stachys, his beloved, Phoebe, our sister, and Quartus, a brother. He also offered praise to his mother, Salute Rufus, and the mother of him and me. In this greeting, Paul was referring to Rufus by his domestic and family name. that being Rufus Pudens Pudentia, and Paul's statement made the mother of Rufus and Paul the same. The history of Paul's mother was recorded in an old and secret tradition. The grandfather of Saul was a very wealthy Benjamite of Tarsus, capital of Cilicia, the rocky province in Asia Minor, due north of Syria. A Romano-Greco Hebrew, he had purchased for himself with a great sum the Roman citizenship for himself and family, and added a Roman name to his Hebrew patronymic. His son, Davidius Paulus, Paul's father, as usual, added a Roman nomen. Appius Tullius took service in the army and rose to be a centurion. His wife, Procede, senior Paul's mother, was left a wealthy widow, cultured by a Roman education. At the time of Saul's return to Rome, his mother was married to Pudentia, the patrician, the father of Pudens. Pudentius was on duty in Rome as a high civil servant when he met and married the wealthy widow. Her marriage to Pudentia appeared to have been very displeasing to Paul, who refused to accept Pudentius' name, proudly proclaiming his father's name Paulus, hence Paul today. Paul and Rufus Pudens were half-brothers, and Rufus was married to Jesus Canubilin's granddaughter, Princess Claudia. Paul's mother was living at the British palace, and the biblical writings show that Claudia was Paul's sister-in-law. When Paul arrived in Rome, his abode was with his entire family at the British palace. It was interesting to note that the Bible recorded Paul had many other relatives in Rome, notably Andronicus, Junia, and Herodion, recorded in the Roman matriologies. This interesting phrase, the children of Claudia were brought up on the knee of St. Paul. He was their uncle, the record stated. The sister of Procede, Paul's mother, was named Miriam, but on marriage with another Roman patrician, she assumed the name of Priscilla. If this Miriam was Miriam Herod, Paul was Rabbi Jesus and Judas's half-brother, and the Priscilla in the New Testament was Miriam Herod. Priscilla was also a resident at the British palace in Rome. Procede was the sister of Miriam Herod, therefore she was Herodias of the New Testament. The church said that St. Paul wrote 2 letters to Timotheus, but doubts their authenticity. However, those 2 letters contain the names of certain people that can be supported historically from references external to church writings. The second letter was written locally in Rome and delivered to Timothy at the palace of the British while Paul was before Emperor Nero the second time. The following statement was recorded. Eubulus greeteth thee, and Pudens, and Linus, and Claudia. The records of history identify the following. Eubulus was Claudia's cousin, a Druid from Avalon, now called Glastonbury. The greeting was the welcome received by Paul upon his arrival at the British palace in Rome. Pudens, the husband of Claudia, daughter of King Caradoc and the half-brother of St. Paul. Linus, a son of King Caradoc and grandson of Jesus, Canubilin. Claudia, King Caradoc's daughter, previously called Gladius, and Jesus Canubilin's granddaughter. In this New Testament narrative, the names of 2 of Jesus' grandchildren, Linus and Gladys, are recorded, King Caradoc's children. The thoughts expressed by Paul in his letter to the Galatians stated that he was continuing the traditions of my fathers and appeared to be transferring his traditional Nazarene ideals into the letter he wrote that is now in the New Testament. Those ideals were Essene ideals, for the Nazarenes were one of the sects recorded by Josephus as being an independent, Essene-derived body of fighting men from Galilee. That Paul was recorded in the New Testament as a Nazarene obviously connected him, like Judas Christus and Simon the Zealot, to the family's resistant movement operating at the time. Paul today is the most revered of all the early Christian churchmen and promoted as one of the spiritual giants by the church, but records revealed that he was a Nazarene fighting for Christian ideals. In the years following the marriage of Pudens and Claudia, Hermas Pastor used the palace of the British for conducting secret Druidic services, and it seemed his name became the origin of Pastor in the Christian church today. Later, Novatus made the Bath building or guest house a title and called it Titulus Pastor after Pastor, and some records say Pastor eventually inherited the property from Novatus. It was later renamed St. Pudentiana in the name the building retains today. Today, the Basilica of St. Pudentiana stands on Via Vimalius Hill, Urbana, Rome, and is built over the ancient palace of the British, which is approximately 9 meters below the surface. A series of underground rooms that made up the original Roman home of Rabbi Jesus Knubeline and his son King Caradoc can be reached through a door situated in the left-hand corner of a chapel now called Setani. In some of the rooms below, the remains of mosaic floors can be seen, among them being a very rare type known as lithostraton, where fragments of different colored marble have been placed between the weavings. Catholic historian Cardinal Baronius said, "Of all our churches the oldest is that which is called after the name of Pudens." However, it was not a Christian church in the manner now presented, but a Druidic establishment for its royal British occupants. The Gospels had yet to be written, and Christianity was still 300 years from being established. King Caradoc returns to Britain. Upon King Caradoc's return to Britain, he lived at Abergwryd in Glamorganshire, on the north bank of the Bristol Channel, between Cardiff and Swansea, where remains of Romano-British villa, Mor Romano, were found. A farmhouse a mile or so down the road from Trevron was said to be the manor of Bran the Blessed. This was traditionally the place where Bran, Rabbi Jesus, spent summers, and nearby was Lian Elid, or Elid, seemed to have been the Welsh name of Joseph of Arimathea, who established his mission under the protection of Bran. The majority of King Caradoc's family were attached to literary pursuits. Rabbi Jesus Knubeline introduced the use of vellum into Britain from Rome, and copies of writings of the best Roman authors were circulated in Siluria and deposited in the principal receptacles of Druidic learning by the younger members of his family. Claudia herself wrote several volumes of odes and hymns. With King Caradoc now back in Britain, Emperor Claudius sought to make a permanent peace with the British people by offering him the hand of yet another of his daughters, Genucia. Initially, this was unacceptable to Caradoc, but he was later persuaded by the nobles to accept the offer for marriage, and was a well-established practice in mending internal and family disputes. The marriage proved entirely happy, and King Caradoc built a castle for Queen Genessa at Gloucester. This was a compliment to her father, Emperor Claudius, whose name in the Celtic tongue was Gloucester. The couple had 4 children, but only 2 of their names appeared to be recorded. The eldest was Udolf Marius, and another was Udal Marius, meaning fair-haired, with Marius being simply a title and typical of the common use made of titular designations by the ancient peoples. The chronicles stated that Caradoc governed his kingdom in peace and tranquility. In war none more fierce than he, in peace does none more mild, none more pleasing in manner, nor in his gifts more magnificent. When he finished his course of life in 80 A.D., he was buried at Gloucester. Upon his death, Silenius, his eldest son by Venus Julia, succeeded to the Silurian throne. Silenius abbed Caradoc, a wise and just king. He first of the Cimri gave infants Christ names, for before names were not given except to adults, and then from something characteristic in their bodies, minds, or manners. Today they are called Christian names, originally derived from Christ, the title of the Essene initiates.